Hello everyone, my name is Squash Gonzalez. We're talking emulators. The history. Specifically. Sorry. I have all this information, and I thought, why not share this with you all? Did you know that I have emulators installed? That's right. It is postulated that there are several internal modeling circuitries in the brain, which are referred to as emulators. And these so-called emulators mimic the input-output patterns of certain cognitive operations, including, but not limited to, action, perception, and imagery. You know what this means? The basic definition of emulation is an attempt to equal or excel the efforts of others. Computer emulation is just this, and has had a long-standing importance in technological development, as well as for preservational and educational purposes. Emulation isn't the only thing that's good for preservation. In fact, there are certain things emulation simply cannot preserve. And that's where our sponsor comes in. Never mind. Now, don't you mean simulation, Squashwa? No. Stop. You're confusing everyone. In simulation, see, the main function of a machine is performed. But that's it. The simulators don't have that unfortunate interaction between the software being simulated and the system it is simulating on. It's Crash Bandicoot for PC. Also, apparently time is a factor in the word's definition. Help me figure that out. Emulation? Emulation, though? You might as well have the actual N64 sitting right inside your frickin' computer. The memory, CPU, the I/O, the blowing of the cartridges to get the games to work. It's pretty much all in there, all in that, the program. Emulation mainly differs from simulation because the exact code from the original machine can be run directly on the emulator, whereas the simulator would specifically need the code to work for that specific machine. And that doesn't have to make sense for you to understand the difference. In fact, it doesn't have to make sense at all. The goal of this video is to give you, the viewer, a better understanding of the history of emulation, as well as its legacy, while I entertain you with my quick wit and intelligent humor. But just one more thing before we continue. Yeah, I don't have any use for this information, so here's this. The very first computer I could find in history dates back to 100 BC, with something known as the Antikythera mechanism. Pretty cool. Now, how do you think emulation began? In a research setting? By accident, perhaps? In bed? Well, as do all fun things in existence, funnily enough, or maybe not, the first instance of emulation was seen as a result of war. Yeah, this is pretty crazy. During World War II, Germans needed to communicate information confidentially between each other on the sea while they were in their U-boats. It did so through the use of what are known as Enigma code machines. Crazy stuff. Stuff that was able to decode ciphers that are so complicated a Rubik's Cube would crap its pants. Actually though, in the 1920s, Polish scientists had already had that code decrypted, and with their help, the British government assisted in the development of what was known as a bomba in 1938. Alan Turing strutted in by request, because the Germans later made changes to the Enigma operations that made the Polish bomba obsolete, and they needed Alan's superpowers. Turing broke the key by taking an approach known as cribs, and later mechanized the process into what was known as a bomba. In 1941, they had started hearing some other stuff. Something different. Something coming directly from Berlin. They had to figure it out, of course. The government called out to the stars. And down came John Tiltman. He was the first to check out this code, and was able to figure out it was something called a Verdum cipher? Through math or something? I don't know, these people are ridiculous. But that's all he got, and that's all they had for a bit. Then, one person screwed up everything. On August 31st, 1941, a certain message sent by someone in Vienna wasn't received by its recipient. So they had to send it again. But this actual goofball reset the machine to the same settings and typed out the same message again. Only they abbreviated some stuff to save some time. Doesn't matter anymore. Responding to the spotlight in the sky, Tiltman studied this information until he was able to decode both messages entirely. It did take a few weeks, so the info was useless, but he was able to produce 4,000 characters of the key stream used by this newly discovered Enigma device. And that was still nothing. This new machine was apparently ridiculous. So they performed a ritual, which lit the room. The light of hope coalesced into a powerfully dominant force, shining a brilliant white as injustice cowered in fear, knowing, but impartial, then swirling into a deep maelstrom of endless potential, legitimacy, and allegiance as absolute chaos swelters within. This all consolidated any positive energy within 100 miles into the perfect balanced form that is William Thomas Type. This guy was given the code, who proceeded to study the code alone. Now you probably forgot because of my last dumb joke, but this guy only had 4,000 characters to work with. Using just this information, he was able to perform the absolutely wacky task of mapping out the entire structure of the machine that produced the code. No, the code wasn't enough. He got the machine down to a T. He figured out the amount of wheels they had, the amount of bit positions on the wheels, the fact that they were paired into 3 sets, and how those sets rotated. You know what? I wouldn't be surprised if Tut also figured out who made the machine and where they frickin' live. So, interestingly enough, if not for that one screw up, figuring this out would have been completely impossible. To give you some idea of the complexity of this machine, to figure out one bit in a key stream would take 4 million trials. I don't even know what half that sentence means. With a bit more effort, they developed a process to decode the message. Then, with a primal growl, the earth opened up, spouting a gloriously wondrous carnival of sparkling ash and fire as the rock and stone crumbled with applause. The skies darkened, the hills they waned, and life shivered with his approach. Cold, dominant, heroic, as he rises above us all, poised and accomplished, but demonic in force. And there he was. And so he was. Maxwell Herman Alexander Newman. Maxwell Herman Alexander Newman built a machine known as the Heath Robinson that could streamline this process of decoding the message that Tut was able to develop the process for. Right? Remember that? This machine made it possible to code these highly decrypted messages very quickly, cutting down the work from 6 weeks to just a day. The machine was very basic though, very mechanical, which made it require a lot of maintenance. Then while I was out in the forest one day, I was getting attacked by some bear. This guy came in on a horse and fought it off, barehanded, and no shoes. He did have a sword though. A dark demon was following me, he said, and at that moment, a great fight broke out. The demon was powerful. It shot what seemed like lasers of bright purple light at this man, who used his athletic abilities to avoid the onslaught. The demon cut through trees, using its changing body as he approached the man, and falling branches and logs to try and corner him. And when it got close enough, the demon went for a jab, and as it did, its arm split apart, sharpening itself into a long, sharp, crystal-like blade. Then suddenly, I heard a loud slam as the demon flew right past me, through a bunch of trees, cutting them all down as its body split apart violently. What remained in front of me was the man, standing after a powerful punch he had thrown, steam seeping off of his fist. This guy's name was Thomas Harold Flowers. After checking out the Heath Robinson, Thomas Flowers was like, "Stand aside." And then he left, and came back a few months later in 1944, with a Mondominus machine. So large, in fact, that right at that moment, they decided to call it the Colossus. And the machine was fast, too. At least for its time. Maybe this gives you an idea but it was too fast for the physical components they were using within the computer. Like, stuff would literally disintegrate because it was moving so fast. Now, the most interesting part about all of this is how well this machine worked. This machine was able to determine pretty much all of the positions and changes on bit patterns in the codes. So any code you put in would produce an accurate decryption. Nerdy facts alert, this machine has the very first use of shift registers, the first technical use of an interrupt in hardware, and the very first use of systolic arrays. Pretty cool. The machine wasn't fully operational yet though, at least not until the day before D-Day. Sources state that many efforts were made to get Berlin to think an invasion was going to be made on some place called Calais, as they knew that Normandy would be a target for invasion due to its good positioning. This worked in the Allied forces' favor, as the message that got Eisenhower to confirm the attack on Normandy was a message decrypted by the Colossus. A message that supposedly confirmed Nazi intelligence thought there would be a big invasion on Calais and a small diversional tactic made on Normandy. Before this message, the Allied forces were entirely unsure of the success of their operation. After this message, the Allied forces invaded Normandy. Sadly, to preserve the confidentiality of the entire subject, they destroyed Colossus. They really did it. The maniacs. They blew it up. Goddamn them. Goddamn them all to hell. Now you might be wondering, where's the gamer? Where's the emulation? Just think about it. The Enigma was emulated by the British government using their Colossus. Yes, that's right. Emulation was involved in the ending of a war. Another important note to, I guess, keep note of is to note that no one outside of Germany themselves had access to these Enigma devices. Not a single person. These heroes, they mapped out and developed an emulator for an architecture they had never seen before, using only 2 sets of 4,000 characters decrypted from a mistake made by one individual. Not only that, it was most likely faster and better than the hardware the Germans were using themselves. And here's a funny conspiracy. The guys who discovered systolic arrays in 1973, they stole the information from Flower's design. They didn't even credit him. Check it. The first public instance of the Colossus was noted in multiple books about the Enigma from 1973. Those guys discovered systolic arrays in 1973. What a coincidence. The important thing to consider about all this is that most of this info on this device and its purpose wasn't really released until very late in the future. Yes, this is the first emulator in computers. And yes, it really has absolutely nothing to do with emulation as we know it. The sad thing about emulation is there is no consistently recorded history on it. Maybe someone was able to gather it all in one place, but even then, some of the info they might have might be right with attempts at marketing or advertising. The first cases of what is known as emulation theory come from 1962, developed and researched by a triforce of IBM engineers working from 3 different angles. Courage. Power. Just kidding. The very first emulator, according to research, was one written by a Larry Moss in mid-60s. This one focused on emulating IBM 7070 programs on the IBM System/360. Oof. The reason for this was to allow IBM's customers to continue running old applications after upgrading their stuff, when they couldn't do the IBM math. There are a couple emulators that were made in mid-1980s that were notable for their emulation ability, as well as what they emulated. There were emulators for IBM 8086s and CP/M operating systems at this point, but this is almost likely a result of a largely incompatible tech environment. Thanks, IBM. Also, how many plugs were made and released between the course of 1970 and the mid-2000s? I wonder this all the time. The earliest video game emulators weren't capable of emulating the entire system. Rather, were focused on emulating very specific games as they played on those systems. Simulation? Stop that. I don't remember where I heard or read this, but I heard this statement on 2 different occasions in my life. I don't know or perhaps remember where to find these gamulators, for lack of a better term, and I don't have any or remember the links to this information. Sorry. I thought I'd mention it anyways because it is a part of emulation history if it ends up being true. Now here comes the fun part. The ROM dumps. I don't want to get political, so I'll just say there are multiple reasons to support them. There are 4 reasons I would like to take note of. 1. Assuring the consumer is not being sold a faulty, broken, compromised, or even dangerous and malicious piece of hardware or software, just the same as assuring that the car that you buy isn't a lemon or something. 2. For the research and development of better hardwares, to keep a consistent flow of new and closing business, as well as consumer supplies, to prevent monopolies and increase diversity in consumer products. 3. For the individual to extend the life of their purchase, as well as to allow customization in any way they see fit. 4. And as a result of extending its life in history, to give perspective to consumers, forcing companies to stay on their toes when it comes to their creativity and originality. Originally, people had to use all these cables and plugs and stuff to access their ROMs. They needed a place for the ROM to plug in, and they needed that ROM plugged into the emulator, and they needed some power plugs and all that. In 1989, developers figured out how to dump the contents of a ROM chip into a file, and run the file through their emulator instead of having to use the physical chip and all of these wires. There were also developments in floating point stuff around this time. Floating points are decimals, and can be really small, or really long compared to your average 1s and 2s. Fortunately, floating point emulators could be used to perform these complex calculations, as opposed to having to purchase a specific chip designed to perform those calculations. The first video game console emulator? I don't know. Sources state it's a Sega Genesis emulator developed in 1991. I've yet to be able to find the name without finding something that contradicts the information as well. This is where the history of emulation sort of just falls apart, to be honest. It seems there's not much for officially recorded history on emulation between 1989 and 1997-ish, and this is where all the good stuff would be. Of course. Since stuff like this can actually result in some confusion, anger becomes a factor. And with anger as a factor, comes entertainment. If you're just looking for some quick drama, or searching for the assurance that maybe you just aren't as bad as you might think, just do some emulation research. No, really, the computer tech and programming fields are caked in theft, irresponsibility, and dishonesty. After maybe like 5 minutes, you'll eventually come up to some wall of shame type website or something. It's some silly stuff. Now we're here, at the end of our video for today. The best way to continue on from this point is to pick a console you like, and search up emulation history on that specific one. Multi-system emulators like MAME didn't come into play until around 1997, but even still, many standalone emulators still have been coming out to this day. I believe the PS5 just got one. I could be wrong, but it's something with the Kai guys or something like that. Some companies go as far as to release hardware emulators, and there are many videos online describing the products and their accuracy to the original products. The A500 Mini for emulating the Amiga 500 with all those HDMI cables and power cables and whatnot. That's a thing. Keep an eye out, because hardware emulators are actually everywhere. It's just one of those devices that people are always going to find a use for, so they're always going to be in development, you know? Those are all the facts on specifically the internet that I've been able to pick up in the past few weeks that aren't just kind of specific to a console, and is also somewhat interesting. I will not be sinking any more time into this specific kind of research. It's a rabbit hole, but I hope I was able to provide for you a decent summary on emulation, and a neat story to boot. Below are the websites I use for the informations. Did it all start with the Colossus? Or were the roots truly in IBM? What is the first video game console emulator for PCs? Also that plugs question. Will it ever be answered? Thank you for watching today's video. Feel free to make any additions or corrections in the comments. I hope you have a wonderful day. Well,
Squash out.